She tightened her grip on the worn leather bag as the boarding house door shut in her face, and when she turned, a stranger was already watching her like he'd decided something she hadn't agreed to yet. The wind dragged dust across the wooden street as she stood there, the last lamp in town flickering behind her and nowhere left to go. A wagon rolled past without slowing. Someone across the road pretended not to see. She didn't knock again, didn't plead, just steadied her breath and picked up her bag like she had somewhere else in mind. Footsteps came up behind her, slow, deliberate. She didn't turn right away. Men usually spoke first. This one didn't. When she finally looked, he was already there, tall, still, carrying the kind of quiet that didn't ask permission. "I've got supper," he said. "You can eat before it gets cold." She studied him a second longer than most would dare, then glanced down the empty road where every other door had already closed. What kind of man offers a seat at his table when he knows the whole town is watching? Tell me, would you trust him? The wind came down Main Street like it had somewhere to be. It carried dust, the smell of dry boards, and the kind of cold that slipped under a coat without asking. By late afternoon, most folks in Dry Creek had already gone inside. Lamps were being lit one by one, soft yellow squares against the gray. Ruth Ann Walker stood on the wooden walkway outside the last boarding house with the light still on. Her hand rested near the door, not quite touching it. She had already knocked once. That had been enough. The woman inside had opened the door just wide enough to see her face, then her dress, then the worn leather bag at her feet. Her eyes had paused there, just long enough to read something that wasn't written out loud. "You worked the rail kitchen, didn't you?" the woman had said. Ruth hadn't answered. She didn't need to. The door had closed before she could. Now she stood there, the boards creaking under her weight as the wind pushed past her and down the street. She looked at the door a moment longer, then let her hand fall back to her side. She didn't knock again. She bent, picked up her bag, and set it back down beside her boot like she might be staying a while, like there was still something left to decide. There wasn't. Across the street, a man stepped out of the barber shop, pulled his coat tight, and walked the other way without looking. A wagon rolled past, slow. The driver hunched forward, reins loose in his hands. No one stopped. Ruth watched the road instead. She had gotten good at that. Watching instead of asking, measuring instead of hoping. 6 years would teach a person that much. The wind shifted again. Behind her, there came the sound of boots on wood. Not quick, not hesitant, just steady. She didn't turn right away. The steps came closer, stopped a few feet behind her, then waited. That was what made her turn. The man standing there looked like he belonged somewhere else. Taller than most, broad through the shoulders, his coat hanging straight down like it had weight to it. His hat was pulled low, but not enough to hide the way he looked at things, direct, without hurry. Caleb Turner. She knew the name without being told. Everyone in Dry Creek did. He didn't come into town much. When he did, people made room without speaking about it. He didn't look at her first. He looked at the bois, then at the door, then at the street. Like he was putting the pieces together, not asking for them. Ruth felt the urge to explain something. She didn't know what. So she didn't. He shifted his weight once, the boards under his boots giving a low creak. "Supper's ready," he said. His voice was low, even, not loud enough to carry, just enough for her. "You can eat before it goes cold." That was all. No question, no offer dressed up as something else. Ruth looked past him, down the length of the street. Lamps were burning now in most windows, curtains drawn, people settling in. The kind of hour when a stranger standing alone starts to look like a story. She could feel it already. The way tomorrow would carry this moment from one counter to the next. The way her name, if anyone bothered to use it, would come second to where she'd been. She glanced back at the door behind her. It stayed closed. Then she looked at him. He hadn't moved, hadn't tried to take the bag, hadn't stepped closer. Just stood there, like he had already counted the cost of being seen here and decided it was his to carry. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she meant. He nodded once. No. That was it. No follow-up. No correction. The wind pushed between them, tugged at the edge of her coat. She tightened her grip on the handle of her bag, then let it loosen again. "I won't be long," she said. It wasn't agreement. Not quite. But it wasn't refusal either. Caleb bent, picked up her bag before she could reach for it. He did it without asking, without looking at her for permission, but not in a way that felt taken, more like something that needed doing. He straightened and turned toward the edge of town. Ruth hesitated one heartbeat longer, then stepped after him. They walked without speaking. The sound of their boots changed as the wooden walkway gave way to packed dirt. The wind was quieter out here, caught on fences and low brush. The town behind them faded to a handful of lights. She kept her eyes forward, didn't look at the windows they passed, didn't look back at the door that had closed. Caleb didn't rush. His stride was long, but he kept it even, like he knew she would match it or fall behind on her own terms. After a while, she noticed something else. He never once looked over his shoulder to check if she was still there. He didn't need to. Ahead, the land opened up into low hills and scattered fencing. A gate came into view, one hinge set a little crooked. Beyond it, a house sat against the dark, a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. Caleb reached the gate, set her bag down long enough to lift the latch, then picked it up again once they were through. The yard was quiet. A horse shifted in the small corral to the side, its breath pale in the cold. He led her up the steps and pushed the door open. Warmth met them first, then the smell of something cooking, beans maybe with a bit of salt pork. Inside, the room was plain, table, stove, a chair by the wall, nothing extra. He set her bag just inside the door. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. Ruth stepped in, closed the door behind her, and stood there a moment, letting the heat settle into her hands. She took the chair he indicated. Caleb moved to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot, and stirred once. The sound of metal against iron filled the space, steady and familiar. He didn't look at her while he worked, didn't ask where she'd come from, didn't ask where she was headed. He ladled food into a bowl, set it in front of her, then placed a tin spoon beside it. "Eat," he said. Ruth looked down at the bowl. Steam curled up in thin lines, catching the lamplight. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, still for a moment. Then she picked up the spoon. Across from her, Caleb took his own seat. Outside, the wind moved over the hills. Inside, neither of them spoke. And for the first time that day, Ruth Ann Walker wasn't standing on a threshold. She was somewhere that had already decided to let her stay, at least long enough to finish a meal. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she didn't push it away. Not tonight. The spoon moved slow at first. The heat of the food surprised her more than the taste. Beans, soft enough to break without effort. A hint of salt. Something steady about it. Ruth ate like someone who had learned not to rush a meal she hadn't planned for. Across the table, Caleb did the same. No hurry, no watching her. Just eating. The lamp between them burned low, the glass smudged with a thumbprint that hadn't been wiped clean. The stove ticked now and then as the metal settled. Outside, the wind eased off, leaving the night quieter than before. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully against the edge of the bowl. "Thank you," she said. Caleb nodded once. "There's water by the basin." She stood, took the bowl, and moved where he had pointed. The basin sat near the back wall, a chipped pitcher beside it. The water was cool, clear. She rinsed the bowl, set it upside down on the cloth. No one told her where to put anything. She watched once, then chose a place that made sense. When she turned back, Caleb was already stacking his own things. He moved with the same quiet purpose he had outside. No wasted motion, no sound louder than needed. "You can take the room there," he said, nodding toward a door off the side of the house. Ruth glanced at it, then back at him. "And you?" "I've got the other." That was all. No explanation, no arrangement spelled out. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. It opened into a small room with a narrow bed, a folded quilt at the foot, and a window that faced the corral. A hook on the wall. A chair beside the bed. Nothing else. She set her bag down and stood there a moment, listening. From the other side of the wall came the soft sound of boots being set aside. Then nothing. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, unfamiliar but solid. She reached for the quilt, ran her hand across the stitching. Someone had taken the time to mend one corner where the thread had come loose. She lay back without undressing, one arm over her eyes. Sleep didn't come right away. Not because she was afraid, just because she wasn't used to stopping. Morning arrived without announcement. Light slipped through the window in a pale line, landing across the floorboards. The house was quiet. No footsteps. No voices. Ruth sat up, listened, then stood. She washed at the basin, using what water remained from the night before. The mirror above it showed a face that hadn't changed much in years, only settled deeper into itself. In the kitchen, the stove was cold. Caleb was gone. She looked around once. The table still held the marks from the night before. A knife left where it had been used. A sack of flour set near the wall. A length of twine hanging from a nail. Ruth tied her hair back, then moved to the stove. It took her 2 tries to get the fire going right. The wood caught on the third, the flame steady once it found its place. She set water on, measured coffee without thinking about it, the way her hands had learned long ago. When the smell filled the room, she paused. It had been a long time since she had made coffee for a place that might keep her. She poured a cup and set it on the table, then another. She didn't know when he would come back. She didn't ask herself why she made the second. Outside, a horse shifted. Ruth stepped to the door and pushed it open. The morning air was sharp, but cleaner than town. The corral sat just beyond the fence, one board slightly loose near the hinge. She noticed it without meaning to. She stepped down into the yard, crossed to it, and pressed the board back into place. It held for now. She would need a hammer later. When she turned, she saw him. Caleb was coming up from the far end of the property, a coil of wire over one shoulder, a pair of pliers in his hand. He walked like he had been walking since before the sun came up. He slowed when he saw her at the fence. Not surprised. Just taking note. "Fence lines loose on the east side," he said as he came closer. Ruth nodded toward the board she had just pressed. "So is this one." He set the wire down, stepped up beside her, and tested the board with his hand. It gave a little, then held. He reached for a nail from his pocket. set it in place, and drove it in with 2 clean strikes from the back of the pliers. "Good eye," he said. Ruth didn't answer. She watched the way he worked instead. "Quick, sure. No show in it." He stepped back, wiped his hand once on his jeans, then glanced toward the house. "You made coffee." It wasn't a question. She followed his gaze. Seemed like it needed doing. He walked past her toward the door. She waited a second, then followed. Inside, the 2 cups still sat on the table. Steam had faded, but not gone. Caleb picked one up, took a sip, and nodded once like he had expected it to be right. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Ruth took the other cup and sat down. They drank in silence. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the place had begun to show itself. Caleb worked the outer fence, then the small shed, then the corral again, each thing in turn, no wasted time between them. Ruth moved through the house the same way. She swept the floor, the broom catching dust that had settled into the cracks. She mended the tear in one of the feed sacks with a needle she found in a tin near the stove. She folded the extra blanket and set it where it would be reached easier. No one told her to do any of it. By afternoon, she stepped out toward the road. The walk into town felt different in daylight. Less like something to measure, more like something already decided. Dry Creek hadn't changed. Men stood outside the general store, talking low. A wagon was being unloaded near the feed supply. The same woman from the boarding house passed by on the opposite side and did not look her way. Inside the store, Mrs. Klein stood behind the counter, sorting receipts. She looked up once when Ruth entered. Her hands didn't stop moving. Ruth picked up a small sack of flour, then a tin of coffee. Set them on the counter. Mrs. Klein weighed them, wrote down the amount, and said it out loud like she always did. 22 cents. Ruth set the coins down. Mrs. Klein slid them into the drawer, then hesitated a fraction longer than needed before pushing the items across. "You're staying out there now," she said, not looking up. Ruth took the flour. "For now." Mrs. Klein nodded, as if that confirmed something she had already decided. Outside, 2 men lowered their voices when Ruth stepped past. She didn't slow, didn't look. She had done this before. Only now, the road back led somewhere. By the time she reached the ranch again, the light had shifted toward evening. Caleb was by the fence, speaking with another man. Doyle Mercer. Ruth knew the type before she heard his name. Lean, watchful, the kind that kept count of things that didn't belong to him. Doyle glanced her way, then back at Caleb. "That her?" he said. Caleb didn't answer right away. Ruth walked past them without stopping, the flour tucked under her arm. Behind her, Doyle let out a short breath through his nose. "Town's already talking," he said. Caleb's voice stayed even. "They usually are." "That ain't the point." Ruth pushed the door open and stepped inside. She set the flour down, placed the coffee beside it, and stood there a moment, listening to the voices outside fade into something she didn't need to hear. After a while, the door opened. Caleb stepped in. He didn't mention Doyle, didn't mention the town. He set a length of wire by the wall, then looked at the flour on the table. "You went in?" Ruth nodded. "We needed it." He glanced at her, just once. "Not long enough to hold." "Yeah," he said. "We did." That was the first time he said it like that. We. Ruth turned back to the stove. Outside, the light dropped lower, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind started up again. Inside, the house held steady. For now. The next morning came colder. A thin layer of frost clung to the fence posts, turning the wire pale under the first light. Ruth stood at the stove, watching the coffee rise just before it spilled, then pulled it back at the right moment. She poured 2 cups again. This time, she didn't think about it. Caleb came in not long after, boots carrying a line of dust across the floor. He stopped just inside the door, like he always did, letting the outside fall off him before stepping further in. He took the cup without a word. Outside, something shifted. A low sound. Not loud, but wrong. Caleb set the cup down. "Stay here," he said. He didn't wait for an answer. Ruth stood where she was for a moment, then set her own cup aside and stepped to the door anyway. Not close enough to be seen, just enough to see. In the corral, one of the cows lay too still. Doyle was already there, crouched near it. He looked up when Caleb approached, shook his head once before saying anything. "Found her like this," Doyle said. "Didn't thrash, didn't run." Caleb stepped closer, knelt, and ran his hand along the animal's side. His movements were slow. Careful, like he was reading something written where no one else could see. "No marks," Doyle added. "Could be sickness." Caleb didn't answer. He stood, walked a few steps toward the water trough, and dipped his hand in. Brought it up, let it fall back. Ruth watched from the doorway. Not the cow, not Doyle. Caleb. The way he didn't rush to a conclusion. The way he checked the ground, the fence line, the latch on the gate. Like the answer was already there somewhere, just not ready to be seen yet. He turned once, eyes passing over the house. For a second, they met hers. He didn't tell her to go back inside. He just looked, then turned away again. By afternoon, there was another. This one near the east side. Doyle didn't say much this time. "2 in a day," he muttered. "That ain't weather." Caleb walked the line from one end of the pasture to the other. He checked the fence again. The posts. The ground where hooves had pressed in. Nothing obvious. That was the problem. Inside, Ruth moved through the kitchen, hands steady, eyes not. On the table, a rough map of the property had been left open. Lines drawn in pencil. Water marked with a thin blue stroke that had faded in places. She wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped closer. Her finger hovered over the eastern edge. She didn't touch it, just looked. Then Caleb came in. He stopped when he saw her at the table, not because she was there, because of where she was looking. "The east side gets less runoff," he said. Ruth nodded once. "Water sits longer." He didn't ask how she knew. She didn't explain. They stood there a moment, the map between them. Then she stepped back, like she hadn't meant to stand so close. That night, the lamp burned lower than usual. The wind didn't come back. The quiet felt heavier without it. Ruth sat at the table, hands folded around a cup she hadn't touched in a while. Caleb leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the wood, eyes on nothing in particular. The room held its breath. There was a place, Ruth said. She didn't look at him. A rail kitchen, north of here. Not on any map folks keep in their houses. Caleb didn't move, but he was listening. Men came through at all hours, she went on. Drovers, buyers, men who didn't like being asked questions. Her fingers tightened once around the cup, then loosened. They talked anyway. Caleb's gaze shifted to her, not pressing, just there. Ruth looked down at the table. Names, deals, land, water rights. She paused. Things they thought didn't matter if no one was meant to hear. The stove clicked softly behind her. She let the silence stretch, like she was giving it time to settle. Victor Hale, she said. The name didn't change the air, but it did something underneath it. I heard it more than once, she added, always with the same kind of talk. Land that didn't match the papers, Water that moved on maps but not in the ground. Caleb didn't interrupt, didn't ask how much she knew, or why she hadn't said anything sooner. Ruth kept her eyes on the wood grain in front of her. "I didn't keep track," she said. "Not on purpose." Another pause. "Just remembered." That was the truth of it. Not written down. Not collected. Just held. Caleb leaned forward, rested his forearms on the table. For a moment, it looked like he might ask something. He didn't. Instead, he nodded once. That was all. Then he stood. Ruth finally looked up. "Caleb." He stopped, but didn't turn fully. "You don't have to use it," she said. The words came out quiet, but steady. He looked back at her then. Not surprised, not grateful, just clear. "I know," he said, and that was the first time it felt like he understood what she was offering. Not information, a choice. He stepped away from the table, took his hat from the peg by the door. "Get some rest," he added. Then he stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Ruth sat there a while longer. The lamp burned lower. The room dimmed around her. She hadn't planned to say any of it. Hadn't meant to open that part of herself in a place that wasn't hers. But the words had found their way out anyway. Not because she trusted him. Not yet. Because he had made room for them. Outside, footsteps crossed the yard. Slow, measured, like a man walking towards something he had already decided to face. Ruth reached for her cup again. This time, she drank. The coffee had gone cold. She didn't seem to mind. Morning came slower that day. The sky stayed low and pale, like it hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Ruth stood at the table longer than usual, her hands resting near the empty cup, her eyes not quite focused on anything in the room. Outside, hooves broke the quiet. More than one. She turned toward the door before the sound stopped. Caleb was already there. He had come in from the yard, hat still on, eyes steady in a way that meant he had seen who was riding up long before they reached the gate. "Stay inside," he said. Not sharp, not forceful, just placed where it couldn't be mistaken. Ruth didn't answer. He stepped past her, opened the door, and walked out. The wind picked up just enough to carry voices back toward the house. Ruth moved closer, not enough to be seen, just enough to hear. Sheriff Walter Briggs spoke first. His voice had that practiced calm to it, the kind that didn't rush because it didn't need to. "Morning, Caleb." Caleb didn't answer right away. "Sheriff." Another voice followed. Smoother. Lighter. The kind that liked being heard. "Victor Hale." "Seems you've had a bit of trouble out here," he said. Ruth could picture the look without seeing it. The small smile. The hands resting easy where they didn't belong. Caleb stayed where he was. "Lost a few head," he said. "Unfortunate," Victor replied. "Land's tricky this time of year. Water shifts. Lines get unclear." There was a pause, long enough to mean something. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. "We've had word," he said. "Concerns about the east boundary. Thought it best to take a look." Ruth's fingers tightened slightly against the doorframe. Inside the house, the clock ticked once, then again. Outside, boots moved across dirt. Caleb didn't step aside. "Fence lines where it's always been," he said. Victor let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "According to which paper?" "That hung there." Ruth closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. The moment had come sooner than she expected. She stepped back from the door, looked at the table, at the place where the map had been, at the cup she hadn't finished. Then she walked outside. The air hit colder than before. Sheriff Briggs turned first. His eyes moved over her, not lingering, just taking note. Victor's gaze followed. That one stayed a moment longer. Not in surprise, in recognition. Caleb shifted slightly, just enough to place himself between them and her without making a show of it. Ruth stopped a few steps behind him, close enough to be heard, not close enough to hide. "They're talking about the east side," she said. No one had asked, but no one stopped her. Victor tilted his head just a fraction. "And you would know something about that?" Ruth didn't look at him. She looked at the ground near the fence line, at the place where the soil changed color just enough to notice if you had reason to. "I've heard your name before," she said. Simple. Flat. Like stating the weather. Sheriff Briggs shifted his weight. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. "Careful now," he said. "Stories travel easy." Ruth nodded once. "They do." She took one step forward. Not toward Victor. Toward the space between all of them. 3 months ago, she said. A table near the north rail line. 2 men. One of them paid to draw a second survey, not to match the first. Sheriff Briggs's eyes sharpened. Victor didn't move. Ruth went on. Amount was $50. Cash. Passed in a glass, not on the table. A small detail. The kind that didn't need to be invented. Name of the man who took it, she added. Harlan Pike. Silence settled in. Not empty. Waited. Sheriff Briggs turned slightly, looking at Victor now. "That so?" he asked. Victor's smile held for a second longer. Then it didn't. "Anyone can say a name," he replied. Ruth met his gaze for the first time. Not everyone can say how it was said. That stayed there. Sheriff Briggs let out a slow breath. "We'll be looking into this," he said. Not to Ruth, not to Caleb. To the air between them. Victor stepped back once, just once, enough to show he had heard. "Be careful what you build on talk," he said quietly. Then he turned toward his horse. Sheriff Briggs lingered a moment longer. His eyes moved from Ruth to Caleb. Then he nodded. Once, and followed. The sound of hooves faded slower this time, like the ground itself was holding onto it. Evening came without much change. The wind stayed low. The sky dimmed early. Ruth set the table, same as before. Same bowls, same place. Caleb came in after dark, later than usual, dust on his coat, silence in his hands. He sat. She placed the food in front of him. He started eating. No rush, no questions. Halfway through, she poured coffee into his cup. Her hand brushed his for just a moment. Warm, solid. Then gone. Neither of them spoke. Not about the sheriff, not about Victor, not about what had been said. But something had shifted. Not loud, not visible. Just enough. Caleb finished his meal, set the spoon down. He looked at the table, then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Ruth leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the chair. "I know." He held her gaze a second longer, then nodded. That was it. Outside, the night settled over the land. Inside, the house held its shape. Not the same as before. Stronger. Because now, what stood inside it had been chosen, not just given. The town quieted in the days that followed. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, The other kind. The kind that listens. Ruth noticed it first at the store. Mrs. Klein didn't lower her voice this time. Didn't stop her hands either. Just weighed the flour, counted the change, and set it down like she would for anyone else. Outside, the men still stood near the post, still talked. But when Ruth passed, they didn't turn away. They didn't nod either, they just didn't move. That was new. She walked back the same road as before, the dust settling behind her boots. The wind had softened, carrying less bite now. The hills looked the same, but something in how they sat against the sky had shifted, or maybe it was her. At the ranch, the gate held firm where Caleb had set the nail. The fence line stayed straight. Small things. They mattered. She stepped inside and set the supplies down. The house felt the same as always, quiet, steady, waiting without asking. Ruth moved through it without thinking now. Stove first, then water, then whatever needed doing next. By evening, the light dropped low and gold across the table. Caleb came in as he always did. Boots slow on the floor, hat set aside without sound. He washed at the basin, dried his hands on the same cloth, and took his seat. Ruth placed the plate in front of him. He looked at it a moment, then at her. "You went into town," he said. She nodded. "We needed flour." He didn't ask what was said, didn't ask what was heard. He just ate. Halfway through, he set his fork down. "I spoke with Briggs," he said. Ruth waited. "He's looking into it," Caleb added. Quiet-like. That made sense. "Victor?" she asked. Caleb leaned back slightly, keeping to himself. That didn't mean much, but it meant enough. The room settled again. Ruth poured coffee, set the cup near his hand. This time their fingers didn't touch, not because they missed, because neither reached. After a while, Caleb spoke again. "You don't have to stay." He said it the same way he said everything else. Flat, clear, without weight added to it, like it had been sitting there all along, just waiting its turn. Ruth didn't answer right away. She stood by the stove, one hand resting against the edge, feeling the warmth through the wood. Outside, the wind moved across the yard, brushing against the side of the house. The horse shifted once in the corral, then settled. "You mean it," she said. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." He didn't look at her when he said it. Didn't need to. Ruth turned then, looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had stood on that walkway and said almost nothing. At the man who had listened without asking for more. At the man who had taken what she gave and never tried to turn it into something it wasn't. She stepped away from the stove, walked to the table. Her hand rested on the wood first, then moved, slow, deliberate, to the place where his hand had been earlier. She set it down there. Caleb's gaze lifted, met hers. "I stayed before you asked," she said. The words didn't carry far. They didn't need to. Something in his expression shifted. Not much. Just enough to be seen if you were looking for it. He turned his hand over. Let it rest against hers. Not holding. Not pulling away. Just there. They stayed like that a moment. Then he drew his hand back, slow, like closing a door that didn't need to be locked. Outside, the sky darkened. The first cold of winter settled across the land. Later, they stepped out onto the porch. Not together at first. Ruth came out, pulled her shawl tighter, and stood near the railing. The fields stretched out in front of her, quiet and wide. Caleb joined her after a minute. He didn't stand close. Didn't stand far either. They looked out at the same thing. The fence line. The low hills. The sky turning from gray to black. "That board'll need fixing again come spring," Ruth said, nodding toward the gate. Caleb followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "It will." They stood there a while longer. No rush to go back inside. No need to say anything else. From the road, a wagon passed in the distance. The sound carried faint, then faded. The town would keep talking. It always did. But out here, the land didn't ask questions. It just held what was placed on it. Ruth let out a slow breath. Not tired. Not relieved. Just steady. She turned back toward the door. Caleb waited a second, then followed. The house closed around them again, warm and quiet. The same as before. Only now, it wasn't something she had stepped into. It was something she had chosen. And that made all the difference. Out on that stretch of land, nothing came easy. Not water, not trust, not the quiet kind of love that didn't need to prove itself every day. It had to be built the same way fences were built, post by post, hand by hand, with patience enough to hold through the wind. Ruth didn't arrive there to be saved, and Caleb never tried to be the man who would do the saving. What they found instead was something steadier, a place where neither had to pretend, where being seen didn't come with a cost. And maybe that's the thing most people miss. Sometimes it's not about who reaches for you first. It's about who stays when they already know what it might cost them. Ruth had spent years learning how to stand alone. Caleb had spent just as long learning how to carry weight without asking for help. But somewhere between a closed door and a quiet supper, they chose something different. Not loud, not easy, but real. So if you had been standing there that night, with nowhere left to go, would you have trusted the door that opened? And if this story stayed with you for a moment, there are more like it waiting. Stories about quiet choices, second chances, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. You're always welcome back.